All right, let's do this. I have this really sweet microphone that I just hooked up. Boom. Stole it from my husband. Like he needs it for work. No, I need it. I love it because it does help clarify and amplify my voice without a little background or cutting in and out. Anyway, um, we haven't quite talked about Darwin's theories yet of natural selection. I had you do a little simulation on natural selection so you know what it looks like and how environment can lead to some selective pressures for a species to change in order to survive and thrive, right? So we'll get to that later. What I want to go through with you is just talking about general theory of evolution and talking about what evidence pieces are used to support the theory of evolution. Again, arm yourself with the knowledge of what is used as evidence for evolution, so then you can have a what do I want to say? A proper conversation about different theories. And, if you don't believe in evolution, that's totally fine. But having that background information is key. So we're going to talk about 4 pieces that are related to it. I'm going to kind of skip through this natural selection part because we haven't talked about it yet. And here we are at our 4 pieces of evidence. So humans have been around long enough for us to see how evolution has occurred. For some species. And so that's what direct observations are. Homology is going to be related to some anatomical or physiological similarities between species. The fossil record is going to be related to paleontology and some chemical components as well. And then biogeography is looking at how species are organized in different locations and kind of how geographical locations can change for Earth as well. So when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about the change of a species or Earth over time. And by over time, we're talking like hundreds of years. We do know that it can occur in very punctuated events or short events that can affect a species. But in general, we're talking like hundreds of years and not just like boom, one day, right? That doesn't count for evolution because it has to affect the entire species or population and not just one individual. Okay. So we're looking at changes over time. So these are our 4 pieces. You could do, a 4 square or a T-chart if you want to when you're taking notes, but you do you. So evidence for evolution include our direct observations. So we've got these 3 examples for you, but basically, like I was saying before, we can look at how species have changed over time that have been included or involved with us as humans over time. So we physically have been able to see this happen. And it's not just like looking at fossil records and comparing it, but we like have direct evidence from our lifetime and knowledge that's been passed along from generation to generation, right? So one of the big pieces has to deal with these first 2 steps up here with our examples of insect populations becoming more resistant to pesticides or DEET and DDT, and this other example of antibiotic resistant bacteria. There's this really old school video that talks about newt populations and garter snakes and how there's this evolutionary arms race that's happening between 2 species, and it can be applied to the newts and the garter snakes, or we could be talking about humans and our technology with these bacteria or insect populations, and how when there has over time, our insect populations have had their genes changed slightly through mutations and through modifications just so that they can be better fit for their environment. So they have this increase in, survival rate, and they become more resistant, right, to whatever it is, to those pesticides, to those antibiotics. And then our technologies have to increase in order to wipe them out. And then they just keep on developing and modifying and evolving to better suit their environment. So there's just this battle between different organisms. So that's kind of related to an evolutionary arms race. Feel free to look into those terms. The next example down here on the right, I don't think my mouse is really showing up for y'all, but that's okay. That's a peppered moth example, which is classic natural selection evolution. And we usually go into this in class, but basically we know we started off, being natural inhabitants of the world, and then developing our ability for agriculture and domestication. And so our land shifted and became more of the countryside, right? And then we had our industrial revolution and the pop-up of cities across the United States, right? So as this happened and as this change over time occurred, we've also seen this increase in pollution. And so these peppered moth examples down below represent moths that reside in the city versus the country, and how their camouflage for their specific location. So it's kind of a natural selection connection. But again, pollution in the city represents the black moth on the left, and then the ones on the right can kind of survive and camouflage within their countryside or their natural habitats a little bit easier. So we've seen those changes over time. This is gene mapping. I'm not going to go into it quite yet because I saved this stuff for biotech. But basically, we can see how there's some different gene sequences or segments that are going to be associated to some specific areas for that antibiotic resistance, which we see here, and other components that are related to that. But it's just kind of showing the genetic piece to it. When we talk about evidence for evolution and we're talking about homology, we are going to be covering mainly these 4 examples, and there are some that I'll dive a little bit deeper into. But homology, again, is going to be looking at the physiological or the anatomical similarities, which suggests that there has to be a common ancestor between our species. So homologous structures are going to be looking at similar anatomical structures between the organisms. So homologous, homo meaning the same structures, same anatomy. Embryonic homologies are going to suggest that there is some sort of common ancestor based off of the similarities in early development for different species. Vestigial organs or vestigial structures are going to be structures or organs that no longer serve a purpose or have very little use for that species, which suggests that their common ancestor once did, and that they evolved to no longer need that, which we'll look at some of those. And then molecular homologies is basically looking at gene sequencing and comparing different species gene sequences and seeing how we're 99% the same, and there's only 1% that's different. Homologous structures. Here we are looking at the general anatomical structures between our human, cat, whale, and bat, how they all have a humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. They just kind of take some different structure to them, but they're all present. So that's suggesting that there's got to be a common ancestor between all these different species having the need for the same structure. Embryonic development. You can Google this as well and say evolution embryonic development and see this picture of all sorts of organisms. Now, I'll just pull it up for you so you can see it. Anyway, we're going to be focusing on these pharyngeal pouches, representing how organisms breathe, and then our post-anal tail, which is just representing our tailbone. Okay, so we can see how human and chick embryo here have very similar embryonic developments here. We can't really tell the differences if we put them side by side with each other. And that's the same if I go, let's see if I can grab it. and say embryonic development evolution. It's freaky. Thanks. Listen to me. Okay. I'm just randomly clicking on something and hoping for the best. You guys ever do that? No, don't do that. Anyway, here's our pictures of like stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 of development of embryos. So we got fish, salamander, tortoise, chicken, and human. And we can see in this early embryo development, the pharyngeal pouches or the gill slits, how each of these species have them. And they also have, like a tailbone or a tail that's associated to them. And then over time, we can see that their development kind of leads to some specific speciation here. And we can tell that there's are differences, but this is what we're focusing on, how there must be a common ancestor. Why would each of these organisms have the same sort of embryonic components to them early on if they didn't have a common ancestor? So that's one piece. Okay. Moving on, vestigial structures are fun to talk about. So here's an example of a flightless bird, a bird with wings, but no chance that thing's taken off the ground with those weak things. Anyway, so a structure or an organ that species has, but no longer serves a purpose or has very little use for them. So, right, these wings, like I was talking about, would be an example of that. The naked mole rat. My gosh, love that one. We've got the appendix, which no longer serves a purpose for us. Wisdom teeth that I talked about in class, how people are being born without wisdom teeth now, which is awesome because we no longer have that dietary need for them to mash up our herbaceous diet. Anyway, whales and snakes, gross, I hate snakes, have vestigial structure of hip bones in them, which they don't have hips. So they must have some sort of common ancestor that needed them before. Okay. Moving on to our molecular homologies, which is going to be looking at the DNA sequences themselves and comparing them together. So we'll eventually do this thing. It's called a BLAST lab, where we will be looking at a storage unit of all of gene sequences and proteins that actual scientists use for their research when they're comparing molecular homologies or when they're comparing DNA sequences between organisms. So we can see, similarities, and we can also find differences. So basically, right, every living organism is going to be 99% the same, and there's only 1% that really makes us different from one another. So we've got that. Anyway, if we were to break down the molecular data for each of these organisms, we can compare. Sorry, my camera thing is in the way. Boom. We can see the number of differing amino acids between each of these organisms as they compare to a human. So that's what we're looking at, and saying that, the whole total chain length is 146. There are some similarities even with the lamprey or the jawless fish down there with humans, which suggests that there must be some sort of common ancestor to have these similarities, but also kind of gives us unique traits for those differences. Okay. Continuing on, I'm going to talk about why, what terms are associated when we have these similar resemblances between species. So there's a type of evolution called convergent evolution. So when we talk about converging, right, we're coming together at a point, saying how distantly related species, or I could kind of go this way, distantly related species can resemble one another, and they're going to have a common ancestor that kind of joins together here at my little fork that I made. So they might run into the same problem or same issues and then develop similar solutions. And And that has to deal with, again, another anatomy piece called analogous structures. So we're going to see similar structures that lead to functions in similar environments. So we've got the shark, the penguin, the dolphin. That would be an example of all that. We got our flying squirrels or our glider squirrels in different geographic locations, but the same general need. And this one up here is talking about, the shark, penguin, dolphin is kind of talking about their needs for underwater pieces to keep them warm. Right, so like blubber and that sort of thing. And then our last piece of evidence for evolution, or not last piece, sorry. Our third piece is the fossil record. So we're looking at, the chemical components that are in our sedimentary rock. So we can see and do some timeline pieces to trace when organisms were alive and relate that together. We can also look at, just in general, the study of fossils in paleontology and looking at their overall structures and physical similarities, and show some suggestions for common ancestors. So here's some examples of ankle bones down below of different species and how they are related to each other. So that's our third one. And then some of you might be wondering, sorry, what this is, which is an amphibian of some sort. Anyway, continuing with our fossil record piece, it can show more links with that. So show some, I like these ones, the transitional ones, where it's not just like night and day, that there was like this process and eventual gradual shift in whatever, physical anatomical structures there were that eventually linked older species to modern species. We can show this by using a number of different visuals. This is called an evolutionary tree, aka a cladogram, aka a phylogenetic tree, depending on how detailed in its what it's based off of. So this would be a cladogram because it's based off of some physical characteristics that we can see listed down below here. We have these different branching points, which are called clades, and then that suggests what's most related to each other and where their common ancestor points are. So all of these link back to point 1 down here. Anyway, this point 1 is suggesting that this is the oldest ancestor that connects all of these organisms together, all of these species together. And then each little purple dash that we have here represents a new trait that has been introduced that now kind of separates the oldest species from the rest. And then we can see that this also represents kind of a time frame over here. This one's written in oldest to newest. Most often they're written the other way around, but you can give us a visual through an evolutionary tree. And here's our last piece of evidence for evolution, which is called biogeography, and just looking at the general geographic distribution of species and how, like before, when we were talking about those analogous structures, how we can have these different geographic areas and still have species resemble each other, even though they may not have interacted with each other to begin with, like directly, or perhaps they were once together in the same geographic location, and then, through some natural events, different islands were made that caused them to separate out. Or there could be this endemic species here, where we see that they're found at a certain location and nowhere else at all. So some different pieces of biogeography for us. So again, here's some different looks at how we can see evolution through that. Species A, this is kind of like our control group, what it all started out with. And then we can see that 2 islands separated, and A had some selective pressures on this different island that also evolved into a new species B. We can see that maybe species B was better thriving in this new island that formed over here, and it just kind of continues from there, and different, barriers, geographical barriers causing groups to kind of evolve and separate from one another. But we can still see that this all stemmed from species A at the beginning. So there's that common ancestor. And this is one of Darwin's theories that he went through in his pieces of evidence. He was like, hey, why are there so many, right? He traveled to the Galapagos, looked at all these different organisms, finches, tortoises, made so many different drawings. Anyway, he saw these tortoises and was like, well, they're all tortoises. Why do they have these different shapes to them? What gives them, these specific traits? And he went through the details of that. So that was Darwin's piece. Anyway, this links all the way back to our sketch notes that we did on like really early Unit 1, talking about the central dogma and how there are main components for biology. And one of them is that there's going to be a common ancestor for all of life. So we can see our different domains and how they're related to each other, and that there is some sort of connection to them later on based off of, could it be the molecular homologies or the DNA components? Most likely, that's where this common ancestor is being identified, and not just the physical structures, because we don't have access to all that information. So there's that.